everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 21st, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. So for the American listeners and those who have adopted this holiday around the world, happy Thanksgiving, everyone. I hope that you are having a wonderful time with your family or with your chosen family, or maybe you're alone. And hopefully that is your choice to do. I'm thinking about you. I am going back home. I'm recording this before the holiday. I'm going back home to visit my chosen family back in Los Angeles. So I'm thinking about you, and I just want to share how grateful I am for all of you who continue to stick with me year after year on the show. I do want to give a shout out to my top tier patrons. This is a total gratitude shout out. So this week I want to thank Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, Patrick Flynn, and Ulrika Hagman. They are within the top tiers. But I also just want to kind of randomly pick a few people here to tell you how grateful I am to you. And that includes, we got lots of Gregs, maybe Greg Fife Bell or Hall. I'm grateful for all of you. I'm grateful for Jeanette. I'm grateful for Julie Doncaster. I'm grateful for Sarah Bronstein and Terry Masters. And I'm grateful for Phil Stark and Rochelle Gardner-Rowe. I'm grateful for Sarah Wolf and for Scott Wildman and for everybody else who contributes to the show and makes it possible. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. You know who else I'm grateful for? It's my guest this week. This is an incredible show. I don't know, it was just very fulfilling to me, really inspiring, really stimulating. So I'm really grateful for Dr. Karen Bakker. Let me tell you just a little bit about her. She's a professor at the University of British Columbia. She got her PhD from the University of Oxford. She was a Rhodes Scholar. She's currently the Martina S. Horner Distinguished Visiting Scholar, it's a fellowship at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. She studies environmental governance and digital transformation. And if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, that's okay, because she's going to help you understand. She has a new book out. It's called The Sounds of Life: How Digital Technology is Bringing Us Closer to the Worlds of Animals and Plants. We're going to be talking about the field of bioacoustics, but we're going to be talking about so much more than that. So I hope you'll come on this journey with us. I thank you for being here. And without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Karen Bakker. Karen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I think that your new book, The Sounds of Life: How Digital Technology is Bringing Us Closer to the World of Animals and Plants, actually dropped here in the US the day before my birthday. This is very special.
Happy birthday.
Happy belated. And I am really excited to talk about this specific subject because, number one, I don't think it's something that we talked about on the show, which is I feel like anytime we haven't talked about something, it's surprising because your episode is going to be episode 432.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've gone a lot of different places, but also because I think the typical narrative is that digital technology is taking us farther away from nature.
Yeah, the typical narrative is exactly that digital technologies alienate us from nature. So one of the points I wanted to make with the book is this wonderful capacity of digital technology to open us back up to these sort of intimate, surprising, playful insights into the world of other species. And that actually it's such a hopeful message. It's really resonating well with people.
Oh, I love that. And so tell me, what did you study? Like, what kind of was your academic path to the PhD and beyond?
Oh my goodness. Where do I start? Okay. I did 2 undergrad degrees.
Okay.
in a combined program that essentially saw me graduate with a BA and a BSc. On the science side, I specialized in physics, and the liberal arts led me to range across everything from formal logic and philosophy to anthropology and geography. But then I grew very interested in environmental issues at a time in the 1990s when climate change was just emerging as a scientific topic. And so when I started my PhD, I wanted to work on climate change, which at that time was still, I would say, a scientific subject that was not widely embraced, shall I put it, across academia. That my supervisor, one of my co-supervisors, worked in a proverbial garage because he wasn't given an office. I was at Oxford for the PhD, but I cobbled together a co-supervisory relationship with a social scientist and this climate scientist, and began my journey exploring the inextricably interrelated facets of our environmental crisis, part of which is biophysical, but part of which is deeply social and psychological. And from that grew just an interest in how we shape, perceive, intervene in the world. Broadly, you can call that environmental governance, but that sounds so dry and bureaucratic. You can also think about it like how we as humans choose to relate to other species in the planet we live on. And I bring a variety of disciplines and methodologies to bear on those questions.
It's so like duh, but also so refreshing to hear that from a very academic perspective, you have managed to take this multidisciplinary approach to something that is by definition multidisciplinary, but I worry is still so often sort of in these different corridors that don't overlap. I guess what I'm trying to say is that very often we leave it up to journalists to do the synthesis because the scientists are working within their one very specific field. And I know this, and I feel like I can say this because I too am a scientist. We sort of like CYA, we sort of cover ourselves by going, oh, that's not my area of expertise. I can't speak to that.
Indeed. And so academic disciplines are enabling and constraining. It's enabling to have a set of parameters and a canon and a common set of methods. I think they were more enabling in the past than they are now. I feel like they're increasingly constraining in a world where so many of the wicked problems we face are interdisciplinary and require people to synthesize. And I agree with you that sometimes we leave it to journalists to do that work of synthesis, and it's a shame more scientists aren't stepping up. And so that is what brought me to The Sounds of Life, which is a work of synthesis across many fields, but in a very journalistic storytelling style. And I wish more of my colleagues would carve out the space to do that, because I think these are stories that everyone needs to hear.
Did you feel, and I mean, I don't know if there's even a way to answer this question, but did you feel relatively confident because of your own academic journey to speak to all of the different sort of components of this synthesis? Or did you feel like you had to do a pretty deep dive and talk to a lot of other experts to be able to synthesize everything the way you felt like you needed to for this book?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So just to give context for your readers, the book synthesizes research, groundbreaking research on bioacoustics, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment. That is the sounds made by other species, many of which are beyond human hearing range. And I synthesize research on this topic across computer science and ecology and acoustics, and thus engineering and biology and philosophy and indigenous studies. So this goes all the way from the hard sciences to the humanities. It took 7 years. I first had the idea when I went on sabbatical to Stanford and spent years doing interviews. There are over 4,000 researchers cited in the book.
Wow.
This is a trade book, meaning it's meant for people to read with no scientific background and be an enjoyable story. The biggest compliment I got recently is someone said they bought it, but their 8-year-old took it and started reading it and wouldn't give it back.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, that's
awesome.
great.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what this is all about. But there are a lot of references in the back of the book. And I did feel that it was very important because the book makes some very, very dramatic and controversial claims. I felt it was really important to have that backed up by the peer-reviewed research in a pretty robust way. So if you get your hands on the book, you'll see it's a very pretty book. It's a very readable book, but there's a much larger than usual reference section at the back.
Oh, I love that. And so let's dive into this concept, this kind of overarching concept that you grappled with in the book, which I don't know, maybe the broadest way to define it would be communication. What do you think? What's a good all-encompassing term for the way that organisms react to one another?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me offer a thought, which is that humans, compared with our cousins on the tree of life, are relatively poor listeners. Our sense of hearing is relatively weakly developed compared to our sense of sight. This is not the case with many, many other species. And so it turns out that the majority of other species are much better listeners than we are. And much of the communication they're listening to is inaudible to the naked human ear. It's either in the high ultrasonic above our human hearing range or in the low infrasonic below human hearing range. And when I say there's a lot of sound communication, I mean it's continuous. It's sounding in a chorus all around us. It's not just intermittent. The planet's geophony, for example, the sounds made by planet Earth. If you had sufficiently well-developed ears to hear in the infrasonic, maybe like really powerful elephant ears, because they can hear in the infrasonic, you would hear the sounds of a distant hurricane, maybe the calving of a glacier far away. You could hear thunderstorms well before they're visible or before rain falls. The most powerful infrasonic devices can hear ocean waves colliding over continental shelves. It creates a kind of drumming heartbeat for our planet. Earthquakes resonate the Earth's atmosphere at very low infrasonic, like a quiet ringing of a bell. There is a continuous sounding, and that's just from our planet. It turns out that many organisms, in addition to this geophony, are sounding with a beautiful biophony. So we recently discovered, for example, that peacocks, the mating dance of the peacock? So we tend to assume that's a visual display, and in part it is, but actually it's also a sonic display. The peacocks are making very powerful sound with their tails. That the biomechanics of the tail amplify the sound. If you look at it, it's got this kind of curved shape. You can kind of imagine how that would work to amplify the sound. And then that's vibrating the comb on the peacock's head, but also the peahen's head. And if you could hear this, it'd be like a loud revving of a car engine, but it would sound like nothing more than a ghostly breath of wind to us. We simply cannot hear this intense conversation. And that is occurring across a huge range of species, including insects and even plants. And researchers have only just begun to discover this using digital bioacoustics.
Oh, and it's not even just that we can't hear it, but we can't feel it. It sounds like the animals can feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because sound is closely linked to something called biotremology or vibroacoustics, whereby this provides a mechanism for even organisms without ears or any obvious hearing apparatus to actually sense sound and to interpret really precise ecological information from sound. Let me just give you one little nerdy example because it's so cool. Professor Heidi Apple at the University of Toledo has done some fantastic work using a very simple methodology, but what was amazing and kind of transgressive about it is she did something to plants that normally we only do to animals. And so what she did is a playback experiment. And in a playback experiment, what you do is you play a sound and you watch the animal. So if you play a sound, the bird flies away or it comes closer. Plants cannot move. So what you do is you measure other reactions like the direction their roots grow, the production of defensive chemicals. So Heidi Apple took this very simple plant. It's actually just a common weed, a model organism used in plant science. It's called Arabidopsis thaliana. And she played a recording of a caterpillar chewing a leaf. Okay, no caterpillar was on the premises, just the sound of the caterpillar chewing the leaf. Okay, the plant produces defensive chemicals just when it hears that sound.
But how does it hear it?
Well, in a moment. Wait. Not only that, but she played sounds of vibrations from wind or vibrations from insect song and sound, all sorts of sounds, but the plants only produce the defensive chemicals in response to the insect predators. And they would in fact ignore the sounds of insects that were not direct predators on that species.
Wow. So not only could it hear it somehow, it could also discriminate these sounds?
It could discriminate. High capability discernment, far more nuanced than our hearing ability. And now, if you think about it, it makes sense. Biochemistry, of course, we know there's signaling in plants, but it only works up to a certain point. Sound is actually faster. If you have an aggressive predator, it makes sense that you would want to be able to respond quite quickly. And sound is a high-speed signal that is easy to detect at little cost. And sound travels actually much further and through diverse substrates. It'll go through air or water or soil or even stone. So it would make sense, if you think about it, that the ability to sense sound is probably ancient and possibly universal in plants. And how they're hearing, in this case, is they have little hairs, tiny hairs on the surface of their leaves called trichomes. The hairs actually selectively vibrate in the frequency range of the plant's primary insect predator. So they're like little mechanical acoustic antennae. They're exquisitely tuned. But think about it. So you have cilia inside your ears.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like they have a cochlea just on the outside.
Yeah, they're like inside out ears, but they have those hairs all over their bodies. So imagine they're listening with their entire bodies. So their sense of hearing is going to be profoundly different from and orders of magnitude more sensitive than our own. So Heidi Appel's not the only person that's done these experiments, but I like to select that one to discuss because it illustrates the degree of discrimination and the ability to derive ecologically meaningful information from sound that plants possess. So that then poses a set of big philosophical questions if all organisms are indeed attuned to sound. And that is one of the main arguments of the book that we have overlooked, or Western science, because I should say that indigenous communities and traditional knowledge has long held and understood the ability of organisms to receive sound and make sound. But Western science has largely been deaf to this ability. And it turns out that a far greater range of species both produces sound and is responsive to sound than we ever previously understood. And that then raises, as I go on to explore in the book, some important and exciting questions about the definition of language and undercuts human exceptionalism in that regard, and also opens the door to the potential for interspecies communication, which is one of the most controversial things that scientists are now attempting.
Oh, that's fascinating. So before we get into some of these sort of like outcomes, these things that this clearly like opens up questions about, just the simple concept of geophony, of biophony, the simple concept that there are organisms all around us who are perceiving sounds at levels that are below or above our own thresholds to perceive sounds. Is this in and of itself controversial? Like, did people push back against her work, the researcher that you mentioned?
No, they didn't. So, and that is because over the past couple of decades, there's been an explosion in bioacoustics research that is now increasingly digitized. So as you can imagine, with digital transformation, the analog technologies we used to use to record these sounds, when they went digital, those technologies became highly miniaturized, inexpensive, portable, and able to be used by both professional bioacousticians, but also scientists who don't consider themselves acousticians. Lots of field ecologists just add this tool to their toolkit.
Well, maybe even citizen scientists.
Amateurs, right? That's right. Yeah, so there's this cool device called an audio moth like the insect, AUDIOMOTH. You can go and look it up. It's an open source device. You can order one off the shelf, or you can order the components and assemble it yourself. and you too can go out, and many, many thousands, tens of thousands of people are recording nature at various frequencies. And this is like a planetary scale hearing aid. It extends humanity's ability to listen to the planet well beyond the limits of our sensory capacities. These devices are being installed from the depths of the ocean to the highest mountaintops, from the Arctic to the Amazon. Continental-wide listening arrays are being set up. So I compare this in significance to the optics revolution. Several hundred years ago, the telescope and microscope both accompany and stimulate what was called the scientific revolution and the enlightenment of the day. Telescopes, of course, enable us to see into the heavens and even eventually back into time. Microscopes enable us to reveal this unsuspected microbial world. People were shocked and that these microbes existed below the level of human visual perception. And what that led to was a profound rethinking. It extended our scientific capacities, but even more profoundly, it extended the human imagination. And that the optics decenters the human from the center of our solar system. And sonics in the 21st century is playing a similar role. We're only at the beginning of discovering many profound things, one of which is the existence of language across the tree of life, not just confined to humans. And we're also further decentering the human as we start to uncover this knowledge. And so that's if you like, the philosophical implications of this huge scientific agenda, which is risen up over the past decade.
Oh gosh, there's so much. There's so much to dive into. I can't help but think about, I remember once watching a talk by actually a friend of the show, Katie Mack, who is a well-respected astronomer. And in her talk, she was showing, I can't even remember, it was like a galaxy, some beautiful cosmic picture. It's like a Hubble image, I think. And then she was like, this is how we're used to seeing it, but this is what it looks like in IR. This is what it looks like in X-ray. And so like going through the visible spectrum and showing all the things that we can't really detect. We're so used to just the visible spectrum, but these are all the different types of signals, basically electromagnetic signals that are put off. And when you kind of look through these frames, we get more data. And I can't help but make that analogy in my mind to sound waves that are outside of our realm of perception. That like, how do we even visualize a sound that we can't hear?
Well, I will tell you the spectrogram.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so a spectrogram, and this is why it's too bad we're just audio here. But dear listener, imagine a visual representation of a spectrum of frequencies that is a little bit like an MRI or an X-ray, but instead of taking a picture of bones or organs, what you're taking a picture of is the distribution of different frequencies over time. So you can basically convert the audio frequencies. If you would have time on your x-axis and you'd have the frequencies on your y-axis, you would see changes in frequency over time. But the very cool thing is you can apply this not only to individual organisms, which is called bioacoustics, or individual species, but you can also apply it to entire landscapes. And that's when you produce something called a soundscape. So a soundscape is like a picture of the collection of sounds made in a landscape. And so if you're in a tropical forest, you might hear the trickle of a stream, the roar of a waterfall, the rustle of leaves, the slither of a snake, the chirping of birds, the croaking of frogs. And the one very cool thing about spectrograms is that they reflect biodiversity. A more diverse landscape will have lots of different frequencies because of something called the acoustic niche hypothesis. So the acoustic niche hypothesis is a pretty profound statement. What it says is that species evolve over time to occupy different acoustic niches, which means that rather than compete with one another for the same frequencies, they distribute themselves just like radio stations on the radio dial. So The elephants are low, the birds are in the middle, the bats are very high, and they're not then competing for any one frequency band. And they know which frequency band to tune into to talk to members of their own species. It's a very efficient way to distribute acoustic space. So on a spectrogram, what you see in a diverse soundscape is all of these different frequencies from all these different species. But more than this, you can then use the spectrogram to track diversity over time. A landscape like a coral reef or a forest that is degrading, the spectrogram will start to have little patches, like little jagged holes, because a species has vanished and it's no longer making sound. And then over time, the spectrogram will go darker and darker until it's almost completely
quiet,
empty.
Yeah.
And so conversely, so you can actually use these to monitor ecological health at a fraction of the cost of traditional monitoring methods. But conversely, very cool, a spectrogram can show you stuff that's hiding. So it can show you species that we thought had gone extinct, but they're still there if they're vocally active. They've discovered entirely new species this way. Recently, scientists just discovered an entirely new species of blue whale in the Indian Ocean, hiding deep under the surface, way offshore, but identifiable by their unique vocal signatures. So these are such powerful tools, more powerful in many instances than visual, because we can see below the surface of the ocean, below the tree canopy, even in the dark, even in remote areas, and without human disturbance to these landscapes and species and places. So spectrograms are now what are sort of, if you like, the scientific meme or the currency of bio and ecoacoustics. And they're very, very powerful for conservation as well as for monitoring, environmental monitoring.
It's so incredible that what you mentioned earlier about how indigenous, maybe we could say observers, naturalists, scientists have long understood this concept, even if, whether they had the technological capability, the tools to be able to sort of like codify this and put it on paper. And it's almost like we in the West need to see it to believe that it exists, but that indigenous observers have long understood this sort of symphony, this cacophony, and what happens when parts of it go quiet, when that tapestry starts to have holes in it, and how that is basically a litmus test, an indicator of ecological health. What a fascinating, and again, it's one of those beautiful examples of it's so obvious that nobody saw it within sort of the confines of Western academia until recently.
Yeah. And one of the themes woven throughout the book is the importance of the primacy of digital deep listening as a counterpart to digital listening.
Actually listening.
Actually listening. Listening to nature is has a long tradition and is an ancient and venerable art, which comes with its own tools that we have Western science has long forgotten. There's a quote in the book, Blackfoot philosopher Leroy Littlebear says, "The human brain is like a station on the radio dial, parked in one spot. It is deaf to all the other stations, the animals, rocks, trees, simultaneously broadcasting across the whole spectrum of sentience." And so from this perspective, you could say that Western science is doing nothing more than digitally enhanced eavesdropping. But I revisit this question of indigenous perspectives throughout the book, trying not to recolonize, but rather sort of amplify. And one of the points that's made across many different indigenous communities is that the ability of indigenous peoples, their interpretive acoustic abilities often far surpass Western scientific knowledge, even with our tools. They're able to draw very precise and accurate inferences regarding which species or objects make sounds, and they have very deep understanding of where and why a sound might be made. So they have this deep behavioral ecological knowledge, But I think it's really important also to emphasize that that is relational. So that as you are listening, you are in dialogue with non-humans. You not only listen, but you converse with the animals, the plants, the spirits. You might tell them you mean no harm, or you ask in return to remain unharmed, or there might be other protocols or exchanges that would take place for peoples who are guardians or stewards or guests on the land. And Western bioacoustics is not place-based. It is, in that sense, extractive, even if the stuff that we're extracting is super cool and we're learning a lot. So one of the ethical questions I raise in the book is rooted in that distinction, because without an ethics of listening, I think there is a risk, although much of the science is wonderful and done with good intentions, of using this newfound information to manipulate other species, maybe even to try to domesticate them rather than protect and connect with them. And so the book also tries to, make a call for some consideration in the conservation community about what are the ethical guardrails for doing this kind of work.
Oh, wow. I want to come back to that because I think it's such an important concept that I want to dig into a little bit deeper. I wanted to share with you, I was starting to get emotional as you were telling me, kind of going through this narrative, because I had this very strong memory of visiting the Peruvian Amazon, visiting the Tambopata several years ago, and going to a wonderful sort of an ecotourism / laboratory that is run by a lot of indigenous people, where they study mostly macaws, but I mean, there's a lot of field work that goes on there, but they have a big macaw research station as well. And I remember when I visited, I was lucky enough to go with some researchers, and I came right as a friaje came through, which is it's sort of like a storm that comes down from the Andes, and it cools everything, and it quiets the forest just a little bit. And I remember the first time I stepped into the forest, and those who listen have heard this story before, and I was like, where's all the life, coming in from LA and it's fresh off the boat. And I'm like, I can't hear anything. I can't see anything. And it took days before I started to even remotely adapt to the kind of sounds and sights of the forest and recognize the life all around me. Of course, the indigenous guides that I was working with could point to so many different things. They were like, it's flourishing all around you. Look here, look here, look here. And there was this moment, because I was podcasting there. So I had my, a boom microphone that sort of amplifies the sound, and it's very directional. So I had my headphones on. I was pointing my boom mic. I was trying to listen to the forest. I would hear certain things and they would identify them for me. And one of the indigenous guides looked at me and said, can I try it? And I put the headphones on, and he started pointing the mic, and then he started crying. And I was like, what's going on? And he heard something that he had never been able to hear in the forest before because of that little bit of amplification, but he knew exactly what he was hearing. And it was spiritual for him. And I got very emotional just being there to sort of witness this experience of this technological capability to, I don't want to say enhance, it's not really about enhancement, but to when you saw the technology melding with this fundamental kind of naturalistic knowledge and the relationality that he had, that I couldn't even begin to experience. I was observing it. I was not experiencing it because I didn't have those ears.
That's a beautiful story. And it's echoed in the book in a fairly long discussion of one of the most profound moments, I think, in science, in field science in the 20th century, when the Inupiat in Barrow, Alaska, invited some bioacousticians in, including Chris Clark from Cornell. And one of the things that they taught the Western scientists is that bowhead whales make sound, and that the sound underwater in somewhere, this, you might think Alaska's frozen and barren. Under the water, it's like a jungle. It's so noisy and there's so much sound. They would listen by putting wooden oars to their jaws, and the resonance They would hear, and they were able to tell which animals making sounds for which reasons. The Western scientists were amazed because at that time, very few, if any, were actually listening underwater. The Inupiat had a purpose, which was to contest a very unfair ban on subsistence whaling that the International Whaling Commission had imposed on the basis of the assertion that there were hardly any bowhead whales left after colonial industrial whaling. And the Inupiat asserted that through their traditional bioacoustics scientific methods, they had a more accurate census of the whales than the Western scientists who used only visual methods. And after many years of science and struggle, political struggle, the Inupiat were proven right about many things, including the fact that bowheads sing, possess complex culture, can live to be hundreds of years old. And that they derive this knowledge from a very deep relationship, multi-generational relationships with the whales. And they won their fight with the International Whaling Commission. So I think one of the points I also wanted people to take away from the book is that, Indigenous communities that are stewards of a significant part of the Earth's territory, and on those traditional territories, there's a very high, they were high biodiversity. That it's bioacoustics is a tool that could be used for biodiversity conservation, but we should be mindful of something that's called Indigenous data sovereignty, which is the assertion that Indigenous peoples own the environmental data coming from these lands, including the acoustic data. And it may not always be something that we can just go and record with our boom microphones. Maybe we need to ask permission. Maybe we need to get consent. And that's another important ethical debate that I think the conservation community needs to have.
Oh, absolutely. And it does seem like it's a difficult ethical question of how or when is it even appropriate to, I suppose, to partner, to start to develop intersubjective, relational, scientific endeavors that respect autonomy and are sort of like, unless we are welcome into these spaces and unless we work with the individuals it's sort of that etic versus emic mentality, right? Of like, unless we work with the individuals to determine the sort of least extractive and the most sort of respectful means by which to, I guess, quote, receive this data, and whether or not this data is ours to receive, or these data are ours to receive.
Yes, exactly. So there are principles, of course, Indigenous-centered research protocols like OCAP, Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession, or CARE, another acronym, Collective Benefit, Authority to Control, Responsibility, Ethics. So there's a whole architecture of research ethics now that seeks to answer the questions you're asking. But research protocols only take you so far.
Right.
I think the broader question that you raise of acknowledging that we are guests and we may not always be invited or welcome to conduct research, and not all data wants to be free, contra the internet mantra. These are really complex questions, which I don't pretend to answer in the book, but there are some people some scholars that are really worth reading on this, like Robin Wall-Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, beautiful book. She discusses this in some detail, and I'd really encourage people to go read her work. And there's some other wonderful scholars like John Burroughs, who's an Anishinaabe legal scholar. Dylan Robinson, a Stolo scholar who has written a beautiful book called Hungry Listening. So for those who want to learn more, those are all great places to start.
I'm interested in your personal perspective. So just for a little bit of context, I'm coming at this as somebody who has worked for many years, like coming on 15 years as a public science communicator. I was a neuroscientist, kind of moved into public communication of science, and then later in life went back to school to study clinical psychology. And really only within these last few years have I started to develop a more academically oriented, like social justice perspective. Not that I didn't think that way before, but it's been like more codified in my mind. Okay. So I still continue to work within the public science communication frame. time. And very often I am partnered with other science communicators who come from like wildly different walks of life. And one of the things that I often find myself bumping up against, especially within the sort of scientific skeptical community that I'm often a part of, is this like staunch, logical, positivist view that knowledge extraction, sort of exactly what you just touched on, this idea that data exists out there and it's our sort of job to mine it, is our role, and that there should be that should be unfettered. And it's almost like there's a minimization within this very Western scientific view of indigenous perspectives and even of those very limits that we were talking about. Do you ever find with colleagues, especially because like you came from physics back in the day, people who look at you like you are just like you've lost it when you start talking like this? They're like, you're not a real scientist. You just don't get it.
I do live in Canada, and I live on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples in a context where there has been much debate, welcome debate about Indigenous sovereignty, about ongoing colonialism. If people have followed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Canadian government's apology for genocide, so the context in which I'm speaking is someone of white settler ancestry living in a colonial society. We're not post-colonial; it's still actively colonizing. I would say that there's increasing recognition amongst those who do ecological science and biology that there are traditional landholders. Certainly, where I live in British Columbia, no treaties were ever signed, so that the legal owners are actually Indigenous peoples who still live on the land. And so we also live in a context where we have legal pluralism in Canada. There are three pillars of law in Canada. There's the English common law, there's the French civil or Napoleonic code, and then there's Indigenous law. So these three pillars of and again, this is not a fringe position. This has been recognized by the Supreme Court. John Borrows, who I mentioned, an Anishinaabe legal scholar, has written about this extensively, and is a good place to go look. So just to give that as context, I'm coming from a slightly different, let's say, community of practice in which it is widely acknowledged that historical encounters with researchers and with data gathering have been, part of the colonial enterprise. So that it is now the norm, at least in the west coast of Canada, that one should not be doing, nothing about us without us. But beyond that, Indigenous communities should, according to research protocols, completely control the types of scientific research that are done on their territories, and they decide whether or not the data from those studies might ever be released or not. And in some cases, the data is meant to be kept private, sometimes for reasons of protocol. That is, the data is owned by certain kin groups or families who have, let's say, historical affiliations with or responsibilities to particular places or particular species. So that you may bump up against that in other places, but I can say with some confidence that this is now actually enshrined as accepted research practice in the equivalent of the National Science Foundation in Canada. And not to vaunt Canada, I think we have lots of things we do wrong, but I do think it provides a model, and Australia and New Zealand provide another model for really changing the terrain on which that conversation takes place.
I think that's beautiful. And I think that one of the things that we really struggle with, I could sit here and I could list a million reasons why the US has a lot to learn in this respect, and, is actually, I think, committing some pretty heinous acts, like even today, and will be like well into the future. But I think that part of the reason, sure, there's the protocols and there's the ways that we've been kind of like behind on how we codify these laws and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of it, I think it really comes down to perspective and how we think about colonialism in the US. Like, I think if you were to survey most people, they would say that we are post-colonial. And just the way that we treat Indigenous populations in the US, it's sort of like, oh, let's just like put a fence around it and like say that's yours, but it's still federal. And we're we're the Westerners, and this is real science. And this is like, there really is still like a very like nativist, like brutist kind of like disgusting bigotry that happens towards Indigenous cultures.
I mean, I'm not from the US, but so I don't want this to land the wrong way, but I think what you said is correct. But I would also add that there is a kind of collective erasure or a kind of forgetting. So layered onto what you said is a sort of refusal to acknowledge and a kind of active rendering invisible.
Yes, because there's a psychological, sociological inability. Like I think it's tied to shame. Like U.S. politicians and U.S. citizens are not good at saying we were wrong. We are ashamed of that thing we did. We want to do better. So the way that we grapple with that, and I say we as the royal we, is to go, it wasn't that bad, or to minimize it, or to literally pretend it did not happen.
Mm-hmm. Although apologizing, it might be necessary, it's not as sufficient, and it's perhaps a very insufficient act. And so Glenn Coulthard has written a very powerful book, Red Skin, White Masks, where he talks about these issues and rejecting the colonial politics of recognition, where saying sorry is not enough, and that there has to be a very different discussion around the political economy of colonialism and dispossession. I guess it's analogous somewhat to the reparations debate, where in the Canadian case, greater control by Indigenous communities of land and water is something that needs to be on the table rather than just apologies.
Yeah, agree. Oh, wholeheartedly. And that's the saddest part of this kind of comparison, is that even apologies seem to be out of reach in many instances here. Even something like a bar that's that low and insufficient and actually kind of insulting is still, I think, very often difficult for our political elite, but even for individual people, because I think it's easier to just ignore it. And it's become easy. Our sort of like reservation system makes it very easy to ignore it.
Mm. I want to go back to something you said earlier about that moment in the forest when the sound was made by an animal that your Indigenous colleague had not previously heard, and he began to cry, and you felt very moved by it. Because I wanted to say, one of the other things that I wanted to convey in the book, and it's a complicated conversation to have, is that science is a way of approaching the great mysteries, but it's not the only way to approach the great mysteries. And it is not incongruous, or it is not unacceptable as a scientist to feel a sense of mystical wonder or awe at the amazing things that one discovers, which invokes a sense of the sublime or the sacred. The book is a very meditative book as well as a scientific book. I've had someone tell me it was a very spiritual book, which I take as a compliment, because I think that another erasure or another act of forgetting or another no-go zone for scientists and maybe some of your fellow science communicators is the notion that in asking these very profound questions about non-human language, which then touches on the question of non-human consciousness, non-human personhood, that one can approach those from a purely scientific perspective, the transmission of information between sender and receiver, data, etc., but that there are also these other dimensions to our transcendent experience of nature, which, if you've ever spent time in a really relatively untouched landscape, you will probably have felt. And so I do think Indigenous communities offer us great, and I don't want this to sound like a cliche, but the science told in this book, which is groundbreaking, has learned much, inherited much, and been actually led by Indigenous knowledge holders who demonstrated themselves to be well ahead of where Western scientists were. And so I hope that the book spurs also a conversation about that across the broader scientific community.
As do I. And I feel like even that description that you just gave, I personally feel like was so beautifully narrated, so beautifully navigated because I struggle. My own sort of growing edge is that I look at the world, and everybody has their own lens, which was, developed through their society and through their family and through all of the different constructed ways that we engage with the natural world. And my lens is an atheistic lens, or at the very least, I could say a secular lens. But I don't think that not believing in a God or not believing in anything that I might consider supernatural negates my ability to feel awe or to engage with the sublime. Like, I might not use the word spiritual because to me that's like a loaded term, but I feel like I get what you mean when you say spiritual, and I understand my own personal meaning that I can put on that. And I feel like that was a lovely way that you just communicated this experience, because it can apply no matter what your sort of religious, spiritual, ideological lens or lack thereof actually is.
So Carl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his work on honeybees, and I talk about his work in the book, referred to the honeybee dance, which he discovered, which turns out to be the most complex form of symbolic communication known in animals up to that time. He referred to the honeybee dance as a magic well, right? The more he studied honeybees, the more complex they turned out to be. He was amazed to find out that honeybees have hundreds of different signals, that their language is vibrational and positional, that the way they orient their bodies to gravity and also to polarized light. So they can see the polarization of sunlight. So the way they angle their bodies to the sunlight actually conveys information, right? This is a profoundly complex language. And so he felt a mystical sense when starting to unpack the incredible ways in which honeybees, which have very small brains, are able to do these very complex things. And we've since gone on to discover many more sounds, many more abilities. Honeybees can recognize individual faces. They can distinguish between Monet and Picasso paintings. Recent experiments have shown they're capable of learning to use tools and teach that to other honeybees, right? This is what I mean by a sense of mysticism, even if one considers oneself an atheist. And many of these discoveries take us into the uncanny in a dual way, because the uncanny also arises because we are using artificial intelligence to uncover a lot of this complex communication, and in some cases encoding this back into robots. So there's this very interesting in the work on bats or in the work on turtles or in the work on honeybees that I talk about in successive chapters. There's a kind of merging of the magic well of field ecologists and the uncanny valley of roboticists in this latest research, particularly where researchers are trying to use these tools to speak back to other species.
Oh, I love that. And it also it reinforces this humility that's required as a scientist or a scientific thinker who engages with the natural world, who interrogates maybe the natural world. Like all of these terms that we've long used, we've been talking for most of our discussion about sort of one side of that conversation is our sort of blind spots to indigenous knowledge and to like really being able to hear the things that are beyond our perception. But on the other end of it, there's this, and I don't know if it's a fundamental limit or just a limit as we know it right now, but a limitation that we have that artificial intelligence may actually be able to, I don't think fully, but can plug in some of these gaps or can expand or extend our ability to perceive because of the limits to our own sort of neurological capabilities.
Yes, yeah. To give an example for your listeners, Yossi Yavel at Tel Aviv has done some amazing research on bats. So you put a digital recorder into a bat cave, literally. 15 million vocalizations later, you train the AI algorithm, and it's analogous to the natural language processing algorithms that would underlie, Google Translate or if people know about zero shot or low shot resource languages. You can use these AI algorithms to essentially detect patterns that humans could never hear, because bats speak not only too high, but too fast for our ear to ever decode. And it's through that work, using AI, that researchers like Yossi Yovel and Gerald Carter and Mirjam Knornschild, all of which I talk about in the book, have revealed that bats not only trade favors, remember grudges, they have individual labels that indicate kin, family, and individual identity, aka names. They socially distance and go quiet when ill. They trade food for sex. Mother bats babble at their babies, just like human parents babble at our babies, to teach them to talk. Bats engage in vocal learning. They learn these words through babbling. And when they grow up, the males also learn territorial songs like birds to defend their territory, signal, affiliation with their particular group, a marker of culture, which evolves over time. So we would never have been able to unpack all of those things without AI acting as a kind of intermediary or translator. And that's just one of the sets of species, albeit important because bats are about a quarter of mammalian species. That's just one of the species that I talk about in the book as being revealed to have this, when I say complex, I mean very analogous to human language.
Well, and that's the thing that, like, I know that we're starting to kind of run low on time, but the thing that I can't help but have come up for me as you're describing this, this thing that, we're always looking through the human lens. So we're sort of comparing and like anthropomorphizing everything. But I think we've long had this experience of using not just the term, but the concept of something being automatic or natural, or however we want to word it. Like, we think of bats as like, well, they don't think about all this stuff. They just do it. Like, evolution just made them do it. And whether or not that's true, what does that even mean? Because these descriptions, as you're sharing these descriptions, I personally can't help but start to envision and empathize in the best way that I can with the interior world of these organisms. Like, there has to be an interior world, no?
Now we're on dangerous territory.
This is where things get complicated.
Yeah, and touchy. Most bioacoustics researchers avoid this debate altogether because they simply refer to this in terms of information theory. Information conveyed between a sender and receiver, signal discernible from noise, ecologically relevant information extracted, behavior results. One can test this in the lab or in the field. The language debate and the consciousness debate are very tricky. And I do discuss that in the book. There's a whole philosophical lineage that goes back, of course, all the way to Aristotle. Wittgenstein wrote, if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What is it like to be a bat?, asserted that even if animal consciousness existed, it would remain scientifically intractable because the bat could not explain what it is like to be a bat in language intelligible to humans. So
it could only explain it to other bats.
Yeah, other bats.
Yeah.
So what I would say to Nagel and Wittgenstein is the digital era is upon us, and what we have today was not available at the time that they made their arguments, and that is a digital intermediary, which tabula rasa can learn human language, and tabula rasa could learn bat language and act as a translation device. Now, of course, we know the limits of deep learning. We know that it is narrow, brittle, shallow, that it actually doesn't understand the patterns that it's identifying. But that's where humans come in, labeling data sets, associating patterns with behavioral data. So this collaborative exercise between AI and humans may enable us to, if you like, break the barrier of interspecies communication, which, as I talk about in the book, researchers are trying to do with sperm whales and with elephants and with honeybees with some success. So maybe we are about to prove, Wittgenstein wrong. Check back with me in 5 years and I'll let you know.
I have to say, Karen, before we start to wrap up, how grateful I am for obviously not just this conversation, but the work that you do, the book, the communication that you're doing around the book, how grateful I am for the depth of engagement and discussion of this topic. I mean, it's rare, even on my show, which I consider to be like a show where I like to go pretty deep. It's rare to see contextual depth in this way, that like we're talking about a topic, a concept that touches every aspect of our philosophical existence. And you are not so narrow in your approach to that concept as to say, I have to keep my hands off of that other thing that's outside of the realm of what we're talking about, because it's couched and it exists within these multiple contexts. And I feel like these kinds of conversations are not easy to have, and they're very rare for most of us in life to engage in, and it's exhilarating. And I want to thank you for like bringing us to this place.
Well, I mean, thank you for having me, and thank you for guiding the conversation to so many levels. The question of sound is rightfully deeply moving. Who amongst us has not been deeply moved by a sound, a song we love, the voice of a loved one? Yeah, sound has so many layers of meaning. And beyond data, beyond the science, which are important. And I'm glad we got to discuss some of those today.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Karen, I always close the show by asking my guests the same two questions. And usually I warn them. These are like big picture, semi-existential questions, and I don't think I have to warn you about that. I feel like you're going to be going there, no problem. So I hope that you can answer in whatever context that feels relevant to you right now in this moment. So this could be quite personal, it could be vocational, it could be familial, communal, global, cosmic, it doesn't really matter. The first question is, when you think about the future, like really putting your eyes forward in time, what is keeping you up the most at night? Where are you finding maybe some pessimism, even cynicism, worry, like legitimate worry? And then on the flip side, so that we don't kind of end on like the biggest bummer note of all time, how are you finding your optimism? Where are you authentically and, not like in a Pollyanna way, but like in a true way? What are you actually looking forward to?
I mean, apropos of the book, one of the things I really worry about is the onslaught of industrial noise pollution that we are subjecting the planet to and ourselves to.
That we don't even realize we're doing.
The ambient levels of noise pollution in most urban environments are sufficient to cause increased cardiovascular risk, heart attack, stroke, cognitive impairment, developmental delays, and dementia. Non-humans are even more sensitive than humans. We didn't even get a chance to discuss this, but it is the great unrecognized human and environmental health threat of our time. Noise pollution actually profoundly affects not only animals, but also plants, and quietening the human din, the cacophony that we've created, is actually one of the most pressing challenges of our time. And I get depressed by the fact very few people recognize this. Flipping it on its head, though, one of the arguments I make, and it's the next book I'm working on, it'll be coming out with MIT Press next year. Many of the industrial and digital tools that we've created have also created enormous harm, the technosphere, climate emissions, etc. But they also contain the seeds of a solution. That is, I believe the tools of the digital age can be mobilized to solve some of the most pressing problems of the Anthropocene, and that a new regime of environmental governance is emerging that is data abundant, that enables real-time responses to not only identify but also prevent environmental harm. So it is all too easy, and rightfully so, given the kind of social media meltdown we're experiencing right now. So think of digital technology and surveillance capitalism as something that's very dangerous, and it is. But what I am, kind of willfully optimistic about is our potential ability to remobilize those technologies for environmental protection and conservation, but also developing a greater sense of kinship with other species on this planet.
Oh, I love it. And I have to thank you for being here. It's Dr. Karen Bakker, everyone. The Sounds of Life, how digital technology is bringing us closer to the worlds of animals and plants. And to be fair, this title of the book does not even begin to dive deep enough into what is the perspectives that are actually discussed. I feel like this is the problem with titling books, isn't it? It captures, but at a level that is so thin compared to the thickness of your writing. And so I just want to thank you for giving us a little taste of that, so that people who maybe come across this and say, oh, that's interesting, that sounds like it's so much more than that. So thank you for joining us and for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thanks for a great conversation.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.